Hello, everybody. Happy Tuesday and happy fourth or fifth week, depending on when you started quarantine. The country is shut down and our lives have been changed so dramatically in the past month and have even changed continuously week to week to week. And it is causing such a tremendous amount of change in our lives and in our country and in our mental well-being, and that is what I want to talk about today. So for those of you who know who I am, welcome back to Liz Live. I am a marriage and family therapist and mental health counselor, and I have been doing these live videos almost every day except for one day since the whole coronavirus pandemic it started impacting our country and things were shut down, businesses were shut down. And so I have been doing this live every day just to try to reach out to people and give everyone out there a way to feel like they're supported, because right now we can't see our loved ones, we can't see our friends and family, we can't live life as usual, and anytime there's a lot of change in our lives, that tends to cause a tremendous amount of anxiety and stress and all kinds of other things. So the title of today's show is, Are We a Traumatized Nation? And my answer to that is absolutely yes. And I can't imagine that many people would disagree with me on that one. And so when I'm talking about trauma, before I get into why I think that the United States has become a traumatized nation, I want to talk about the definition of trauma and explain to everybody out there who might not know exactly what trauma is. Okay, so what is trauma? Trauma is a word that we all tend to associate in pop culture with something terrible or horrifying, like a loss of a loved one or the loss of a job, the loss of financial means, because that implicates so many other losses. Okay, so there's loss everywhere. There's something very scary and horrifying that happens to us. And when that happens, we are so horrified and so terrified by what happened that we actually go into somewhat of a state of shock. And our brain and our body puts us in that state of shock so that we can survive the reality of the moment that is happening, that is terrifying, horrifying, etc. But the way that I really explain trauma to my clients is in this manner. So if everybody thinks about the big meal you might eat on Christmas or Thanksgiving or the Jewish holidays, you eat a tremendous amount of food, fat, and calories. And when you eat all that food and fat and calories, what happens is your digestive system is overwhelmed and you can't properly digest all that food that you're not used to eating. So your digestive system starts to back up and all the food sits in your stomach and you get a stomach ache and you feel like crap, and it takes a couple of days, the older you are, to feel normal again from all of that fat and calories that came into your body. That is exactly what happens during an emotional trauma to your emotional system. It's overwhelmed with too much emotion, too much fear, too much terror, that your brain cannot properly digest or actually process the horrible things that you're feeling in the moment. And so like your digestive system gets all, stopped up when you overwhelm it with too many calories, our emotional process gets all stuffed up when we're dealing with too many terrifying emotions at one time. And what might be trauma to one person may not be trauma to another person. So in psychology and counseling, we consider trauma to be relative, meaning that everyone will experience trauma in a different way, and different things will traumatize each of us in a different way. But in today's situation, with the fear of impending doom that we're we're being fed with from the news media. We're being told that, right now, this is the worst week that we might ever see in the history of our lives, of our country and history. And that alone is, it's scary, it's traumatizing, it's overwhelming. Okay. But this has been going on for, about a month now. So we have this fear of this unknown virus that we're hearing has the potential to be very deadly, specifically to elderly people, people with underlying health conditions, people with autoimmune deficiency. So there's this pending fear that, oh my God, what if I get this? Will I survive? Does this, this is my mortality, is this my time to go? Is this my parents' time to go? Or my family members who I love so much who are older, does this mean that I'm going to lose potentially my life or the life of someone else that I love and care about? Okay, so that's the first piece of the trauma that's happening to our country right now, and absolutely to the whole world. But I'm really, focusing just for this moment on what's happening in the United States, because that's the trauma that I'm most familiar with. Unfortunately, I read about what's going on in other countries, but I don't have that experience. So really speaking about right now in the United States. So number one, we're all dealing with this fear, this really scary, palpable fear that if we get this virus, or our parents get this virus, or someone that we love, that we could lose our lives or the lives of somebody that we love. That's the first piece of the trauma that I think is happening in this country. The second piece of it that's happening is the incredible change that has happened for all of us with no warning. We were just kind of going along, living our lives, and boom, the next thing you know, the country is shut down. We are kept separate from our friends and family. We have all of the things that we did for entertainment, like go to movies and go to dinner, and the things that helped us relax and release our anxiety. All of those things are no longer available to us. So we're now confined to our homes, or to maybe the grocery store, or the gas station, or maybe, some of us are still able to work, but most of us, not only are we not supposed to really work, we're supposed to be locked down, shut down in our homes. So everything that our life once was is no longer. Again, you put on top of that the fact that we're afraid of this virus. We don't know that much about it. We don't know who it's impacting next, or if, potentially you or your loved one will be next. Everything in our daily routine and our daily structure has completely changed. Each one of these pieces that I'm talking about alone would be enough to traumatize somebody. Now, let's add another piece. We have the financial aspect. We have, the last number I heard was like 17%, I believe, of the country is unemployed and rising. And my numbers might be off because they're changing constantly, so forgive me. But a large portion of our country is unemployed. We don't know how we're going to afford to pay for our lives in the future, because we don't know how long this is going to last. Many of us who are used to working at a high pace, like myself, can no longer work at that pace because the business isn't there. And that's nationwide. So every single human being in the country of the United States right now is touched and impacted by this in one way or another. They're impacted financially, which you can read statistics on. That alone is traumatic. So if you lose your job, or you lose your means of finances, that within itself is traumatizing. Okay? We're adding the change, the routine, the structure. The family system has completely changed because everybody's home. And on top of that, we have the threat of, could we potentially catch this, or could somebody we love catch this? And then what would that look like? Could that mean death? So we have all of these huge change factors that have pretty much been in one way or another dumped upon us, our lives pulled out from underneath us, and we are, in my opinion, a traumatized nation. When people are traumatized, their behavior changes, and everybody reacts to trauma in a different way. So some people are really good at dealing with crisis. Some people are terrible at dealing with crisis. There's people who will run towards the crisis. There's people who will run away from the crisis. There are people who will lash out in crisis, and they will take out their anger and frustrations on other people. And I think that as a country, we're seeing all of these things happen. We're seeing people, the best in people. We're seeing people become giving and jumping out there and helping other people. And then we're also seeing people, hiding and saying, stay away from me, don't come near me. We're seeing people who are lashing out. Specifically, I've seen this on social media. I've seen it on from a lot of our opinion editorials on the different cable news stations. I've heard, a lot of anger coming from people that I don't necessarily consider news reporters, but they're people who are giving their opinions and their slant on the particular news of the day that's happening. And so that becomes very confusing, and that creates anger. We don't even have regular programming because different things are interrupting the regular programming. So everything that we've known that's given us structure in this country, that's given us a routine, and structure and routine keep us from becoming anxious. That's why we are creatures of habit, and we like the structure and routine. That's why we have it, because it keeps us safe, has been blown apart. And here we are, a traumatized nation. And I believe that, again, we're seeing this trauma come out in every way. I'm hearing it from my clients within the family unit. I'm hearing it social media. I'm seeing people, really fighting with each other and lashing out. People are angry. They're frustrated. They're dying for answers. And so people believe that if they have the answer, that they should tell everybody that they have the answer and that they're definitely right when they're under stress, because everybody's rushing to fix this. And I think that's why we're seeing such really strange behavior from a lot of people. I saw a funny post this morning on Facebook where someone had taken pictures of like 6 different outfits that people were wearing when they go to the grocery store, and they were hilarious, but they were, things that normally people probably wouldn't do, like cover themselves and wrap themselves in duct tape and plastic bags, and putting, people were actually putting plastic bags over their head, which you could die and suffocate from. People are under such stress right now that, we're seeing all kinds of strange behavior. We're seeing a lot of panicked behavior, and our emotional systems are so overwhelmed right now from all of these changes that we really just don't know what to do with ourselves. And that stress and that trauma creates more trauma and more stress and more anxiety. I'm hearing from my clients that there's a lot of fighting going on with couples. There's fighting going on with the kids and the parents because everyone's home all the time, and it's becoming like a hot pressure cooker, and people need ways and ideas of how to cope. And that's what I hope to do today. But before I get into all that, I wanted to be very clear and draw, a very clear picture about what trauma is and what trauma does to us. And a lot of times when we're in the midst of trauma, we don't even realize that we are being traumatized because we're in shock. And I think that that's where a lot of us are. I know myself personally, each week that this has gone on, I've become more and more in touch with the reality of what is going on, where I think in the beginning I was maybe sort of in a denial stage of, oh, this isn't going to get that bad. And then as the weeks have gone on, wow, this is really getting bad. And the more real it becomes and the more shocked we become, the more overwhelmed we become. And that tends to spread to people that we're around all the time. There's so many decisions, tough decisions that have to be made whenever there's a trauma. And people, American families are faced with some really tough decisions right now about where they're going to live. If there's children or elderly people in the house, how do we best protect them? We're now hearing reports of the coronavirus spreading to tigers, and I can't help but wonder if it can spread to a tiger, I would imagine it could spread to, felines in general. What would that mean for our house pets? Are we cleaning enough? Are we doing enough to protect ourselves? I mean, I could talk for 5 more hours about all the different aspects that are feeding into this state of trauma that I believe this country is in right now. So I want to look at the screen and see what's happening. I can't see anything without my glasses. So does everyone, hi everybody, hi Todd, hi Franco, Bella, Renee, Christina, Lydia, and Lisa. Hi guys, you're the ones I can see on the screen right now. Bella asked a question, does everyone who experiences trauma suffer from PTSD? Good question, Bella. Generally, yes. Generally speaking, yes. And again, because trauma is so relative, meaning that everybody experiences trauma in a different way, and different things traumatize people in a different way, which we're seeing, clear as day in the country right now. You can see that everyone's sort of reacting so differently to what's happening that it's hard to predict with any degree of certainty if everybody who suffers trauma suffers PTSD. But generally speaking, to answer that question, yes. Again, what's happening right now, like for example, I was thinking about the military this morning and how they've been such a big part of organizing the disbursement of medical equipment, how like all the recruits who are enrolling in the military, that's being frozen, and a lot of medical professionals from the military are going to New York and New Jersey to help the overload of the hospital system. I was thinking about the military, and I was thinking, wow, like these brave men and women are trained for battle, a physical battle, to get out and fight for their lives, literally in combat, and they're used to that type of pressure. So I wonder if what's going on right now is really traumatizing to them or not compared to what they're used to. So I was sort of thinking that, for military personnel who are used to this, high level of pressure and combat, and, it's hard to even imagine what they're trained for. We probably don't even understand or know all that they're trained to do. To respond to something, to an enemy that is a virus, that is a potentially deadly virus, maybe isn't as traumatizing for that group of people because of their background and training as it might be for, the average person who, is not trained for battle. This would be, I would think, particularly scary for our elderly population because they are the group that is really at most risk of really not doing well with this type of virus. So I think that it's very scary for them. And I think that our country will absolutely suffer from PTSD after this. Now, you're probably thinking when I say that, well, what does that look like? What would a nation suffering collectively with PTSD look like? And I can only imagine. I know what I'm seeing right now. What I'm seeing is, unfortunately, people are picking a side. Not everybody, but I'm seeing a lot of people picking a side, which if you think about it, it's sort of bizarre when we're all sort of in the same boat here. but people are picking sides of, is our president doing a good job, or is he not doing a good job? Is he telling the truth, or isn't he telling the truth? We should use this medication that's possibly and potentially available to us, or we shouldn't use it, and how could you even suggest it? And I mean, my God, I've seen fighting and people picking sides in this dilemma, which is classic behavior for people under trauma, for people who are scared, people who are stressed. Because what happens is when we're under a lot of stress, we tend to cling to our beliefs, and we cling to our group of people who have the same beliefs as us because it's comfortable there, and we're seeking comfort right now. And then once we think we know the answer to save the world, we want to get that answer out there so that we can get out of this trauma. So we're seeing a nation that's in a survival mode, and when people are surviving, they're fighting. And that is, the nature of human behavior. So I see it happening. This has been, even though everyone's saying, oh, we shouldn't politicize it, it's been extremely politicized on the mainstream news media. I've seen it then that reflected in social media, when really we're all on the same side here. We are all on the same side. We all do not want to get this virus. We all don't want anyone we love to get this. We want to go back to life as usual. So there's really no side here. But human behavior under stress and pressure will pick a side, almost like you're picking, your team to go to war with, or, you're picking your group, and then you're sure that you know the answer. So you're telling the world, and social media is the easiest way to do that. You're telling the world that you know the answer, and if everyone agrees and listens to you, then this will be over. But that is a fantasy, but it's a fantasy that all of us fall into, myself included, from time to time. I'll hear certain things or read certain things, and I think, yeah, I agree with that. And if everyone thought like this, maybe we would be better. And then I have to dial it back and remind myself that, I really don't know the answer right now. The only thing I do know is that if we, do our best to follow what we're being told by our public health officials, that's about all we can do in a public way, but that's a big thing. If we all stayed home and if we have to go out, we take special care of ourselves, and everyone's heard all of that. But you are seeing trauma right before your very eyes. And I believe that where we're seeing the trauma come out is news media, social media, any public forum that we have right now. And we don't have even the ability to go over to people's houses and hang out and, have a nice conversation over a meal. We can't even really do that right now. So where else is it going to go? It's going to go to social media, and it's going to go to friends and family. Because again, the idea is if I pick a side and I stick with it, and I know that I'm right and I believe in what I'm saying, if I can convince everyone to think the way that I think, then this trauma will be over. And again, that's a complete fantasy. So I do think that once this passes, whenever that might be, again, we don't know. We really don't. Nobody knows. The president doesn't know. The task force doesn't know. None of us really know how long this is going to go on. So let's add, that's another piece of the trauma puzzle right now, that we don't have an end date. We don't have really a solution. This could go on for, let's be reasonable here. This could go on for a couple more months. And what does that mean emotionally? What does that mean financially? To be kept from our loved ones, to not be able to make a living, to not be able to pay our bills. Where does that take us in the future? So we're traumatized right now. You're seeing it happen before your eyes. And what will happen the longer this goes on, I think the more PTSD we could potentially suffer afterwards. How important is it to remain positive and hopeful during this time? Well, I think it's critical. Thank you to the viewer who asked that question. I think it's critical in any trauma. We've all been through trauma. Not quite like this, but we've all been through the trauma of, losing a loved one, or going through a divorce, or being betrayed by somebody that we love, or losing our job, or losing our money. We've all, probably most of us above 25 and older, have gone through several of those traumas that I've just listed. And when you're going through a trauma, you do, as a therapist, I definitely want to process that trauma with my clients. And processing means I want to help them talk about it with me and share their experiences with me. And together we work on getting a perspective on the trauma. But that being said, as painful as it might be when you're going through it, of course, you always want to try to keep a positive perspective. You always want to try to look for a silver lining and have hope. Because when you're under the stress of a trauma and when you're in pain, all you really have is hope. And I think each of us has to self-reflect in these difficult times and think about what gives us hope. And that might be different for everybody. I think kindness, being kind to other people, is helpful. Trying to look for the lessons that we learn from this time period is hopeful. One thing I do with all my clients when they're going through something really difficult, trauma usually, is we always try to look at, what did we learn from this? How have I become a better person because of having this experience? How can I help others who are going through a similar experience? How can I grow and become and evolve and become a better person because of this experience? And I think there's so many opportunities for that in this current situation, which if you want, I can talk about what some of those things are. Another viewer is asking, how can I tell if I'm just stressed or suffering from trauma, or are they the same thing? Wow, that's a good question. So stress and trauma, I would say, are different. And I'll explain why they're different. So we all go through your regular stress, just being alive, okay? So typical stressors are things like, do I have enough money? Does my husband or wife love me? Or my kid's gonna turn out okay? What's the weather gonna be like today? I have so many clients to respond to and so much work to do. I hope I get it all done. Thinking about preparing for your future financially. All those things are just the general stresses of life. They're things that we anticipate, that we expect, that we know are part of being alive. And as we grow and we get older, we develop coping skills for dealing with those typical stressors, okay? The things that everyone goes through. Then when we're looking at trauma, we're looking at an increased level of stress, an overwhelming level of stress. And typically trauma stems from an event, a particular event that happens that is so scary, so horrifying, so traumatizing that we cannot cope with it. We can't cope with it biologically. We can't cope with it intellectually. We can't cope with it physically because it's that painful. So I think when we're talking about regular stress and then we're talking about trauma, we're talking about, with trauma, a really high and increased level of stress to a pressure point of which you cannot handle on any of those levels, biologically, physically, emotionally, and you literally go into survival mode and somewhat of a state of shock because it happens so quickly, it happens so unexpectedly, and it's really a particular event. So that's a great question. And there is definitely a big difference. So I think that with trauma, there's something that the term was thrown around here earlier, PTSD. And PTSD, somebody asked a really interesting question. Do I think that, everybody in America will suffer from PTSD because of this? And my answer was yes. So let's talk about what PTSD is. So PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. And post means after, okay? Traumatic, so after trauma, stress, right? So post-traumatic stress disorder is something that happens after the trauma actually takes place. And it can go on for months, it can go on for years, it can go on for a lifetime, depending on how severe the trauma was. So, for example, somebody losing their job is definitely very traumatic for many different reasons that, I'm not going to get into all those reasons, but there's many. But then losing somebody that you love is a whole nother level. So the difference in severity there, although it can vary from person to person, but generally speaking, if you lose your job, it's generally understood that you can get another job, right? It's not the only job that you're ever going to have. And we just kind of understand that as a society. We understand how our society works, and we know that opportunities are always available, generally speaking. If you lose somebody that you love, you can never bring that person back. You can never replace them. And so that level of emotional stress is more severe. So let's take it even higher than that. So let's say you're in the military, and I have many clients who have served or are serving in the military, and they are in combat, and they're seeing, many deaths of people that they love. They're seeing, sometimes unfortunately innocent bystanders being killed. They're seeing the horrific things that some cultures in this world do to their own people. And most of us will never experience any of those things in our lifetime. And our emotional and psychological systems, in my opinion, are not built to handle that kind of trauma. They're just not built for that. And so that is generally the most extreme type of trauma. And a lot of what makes things traumatic is our general expectations of culture. We don't expect, generally speaking, to see somebody die. We don't expect to see multiple people we love die at one time. We don't expect, so that level of loss and that level of horror is like way up here, where things that are traumatizing that happen that can be fixed or replaced tend to not be as severe. But you can't fix the loss of a loved one. You can't fix watching, 5 of your friends being shot and killed in front of you. You can't fix those things. So they become even more severe and more traumatic. And anytime you're dealing with loss of life or violence and suffering, watching another person experience violence and suffering, those are generally the most traumatic types of, severe types of traumas. Now, if we take it to today and what's happening today with the country being shut down, with our routines being stopped, with the fear of, potential illness or death, with the country, fighting each other politically, I think that's extremely stressful and sad, because that can break up relationships and friendships and families. It shouldn't, but it does. So you have all these different pressures coming at us right now. Then we have the relationship stress in the family, and parents dealing with their kids and homeschooling them online, and trying to navigate through all that, and trying to keep the fridge full of food and dinner on the table when no one even is comfortable leaving the house to buy groceries. And then having the mainstream media constantly feeding us all these horrible things that are potentially going to happen in the future. I mean, that's enough to make anybody break. And I think we're just starting to see that. I think it was just earlier this week, a month into this, the CDC finally created a crisis hotline for people who are in immediate crisis to call that hotline, and then that hotline will help you find local resources in your community. I think they do immediate, it's called debriefing. So if you are experiencing a severe panic attack or you are feeling suicidal and you call the crisis hotline that the CDC has set up, they can, the people on lines are trained to debrief you like any crisis hotline, but they don't actually counsel you. So they'll debrief you in the moment, and then they will help you find resources in your community to be able to get the mental health help that you need. So I will post that hotline after the show. I want to get back to some of your questions here. There's such good questions today. Does trauma affect children differently than adults? Absolutely, yes. Great question. Okay, so how do I explain the difference here? So generally, in all the comments that I'm making are generalities, and there's always exceptions to every rule, but yes, children absolutely deal with trauma very differently than adults. And the main reason for that is we have different coping skills developed at certain developmental stages of our lives. So clearly, an 8-year-old is not going to be able to intellectually or emotionally process a trauma the way a 50-year-old adult would. And that goes for all stages of life. And most trauma counseling theories and models take that into consideration, because you can't treat a traumatized child in therapy the same way that you would treat an adult. Different developmental stages of intellectuality, of emotional capabilities for processing, just different capabilities and ability to reason, which don't even develop until you're around 10 or 11. So clearly the way that you would deal with it with a child would be different than an adult. But it's also comes out differently, where adults are, much more capable of expressing how they're feeling and getting resources for help. Adults can call therapists. They know how to do that. They know how to reach out to a friend. Children really don't know how to express trauma. So what you find with children who are traumatized is you'll find behavior changes. You'll find grades dropping in school. You'll find them isolating, maybe having more temper tantrums than is typical for their behavior. You might see that in an adult too, but again, adults can advocate for themselves. They can reach out to other people. They can get help for themselves. Children don't know how to do that. They don't really know how to ask for help. A big sign of trauma with children is stomach aches. They don't know how to say yet to their parents, I really need to talk to somebody, or I'm really scared about this or that. I have a stomach ache and I don't want to go to school. Now, that doesn't mean every time your child says they have a stomach ache that they're traumatized. No, but that's just a common sign. Nightmares, bedwetting, sleeplessness, loss of appetite, all of those things that without words tell us as adults that, hey, something's wrong with my child or with this child. They're not acting like they usually do, or they're not acting the way, a typical 8-year-old or 10-year-old would act. So that's a really, really good question. Oh my gosh, this next question is great. Does trauma change your personality? Absolutely, 100% yes. Trauma changes all of us forever. Forever. And as a therapist, I like to think of trauma as being something that can really help us grow and evolve and mature emotionally. But that's not always the case. If there's a trauma in our childhood, that can shape our adulthood. Trauma is so significant and it's such a significant part of our psychological development that I don't even know where to begin. It will change the way we see things. It will change the way we respond to things. If we are experiencing PTSD, which again is post-trauma, after the trauma, if we're experiencing something after the trauma, that can be very disabling. Constant panic attacks, depression, flashbacks, strange triggers that you never had before will start setting you off into crying, into anxiety attacks and panic attacks and nightmares and all kinds of things. Trauma is no joke. And again, it's very hard to, at this point, be able to totally paint a picture for what this country's PTSD will look like. I mean, I have some ideas. I think that our country, after this whole coronavirus trauma is over, I think there's going to be a lot of damage. I think there's going to be changes in our culture, in the personality of our culture. Again, we're going to be seeing the best and worst in people because high stress and trauma tends to bring out the best or the worst in us. And it does tend to separate the men from the boys, if I'm being quite frank, because we don't know, this could become a new threat for years to come. I mean, we might, now that we had this, we might always be super hyper vigilant about, getting another one or another one coming. And, oh my God, I hope we don't get shut down again. And we're going to anticipate all the panic and fear we're feeling now the next time, because our psychological system has a great warning system. And so it will PTSD is a warning, like, hey, we might be getting into the same mistake again, be danger. And it's kind of a warning to us to like take a step back and make sure we're doing the right thing, we're handling things the right way. But I think that our culture will be definitely impacted by PTSD. I think in a few months, there's a lot of people who are going to be flat broke, that are going to be jobless, that might have to go from, one career to another, no matter how old you might be, because your particular fields may not exist or may not be as fruitful as it once was. And that's going to make us, I think, a lot more afraid of spending like we are used to and going out and having contact with people the way we used to. Even if this is completely eradicated and gone from the world, which I don't know that it ever will be, but maybe one day it will be, we're still going to be, at least in this generation, all of those of us who've gone through this, no matter how old we are, will never forget this time, because it's absolutely something so different than what we're used to that, we'll just never forget it. It's changed every aspect of our lives: relationships, family, finances, even spirituality. I mean, a lot of people are, talking to me about that piece of it. And I can get into that in a moment, but let me see what the next question is. Will trauma go away on its own, or do I need to seek help? That depends. Going back to the earlier question, trauma changes us forever. Okay, and if we all take a moment and we think back to the different traumas we've been through, we could definitely trace changes in our viewpoints and our personalities. I think it's too soon to say just yet how traumatized we will be as a nation collectively after this. And I think a lot of our levels of trauma from this particular incident will depend upon how we were impacted. So if you have your own business and you lost your business because of this, or almost lost your business, and you couldn't pay your bills and feed your family, that's going to traumatize you much more significantly than someone who still has a steady paycheck coming in. If you are in the medical field and you're working on the front lines with people who are dying from this, and you've seen people die from this, you're going to be a lot more cautious about your career and your job and your life than, let's say, myself who hasn't seen that in person. So I think everyone's going to be traumatized in a different way as a result of what's happening right now. And I think only time will tell how severe this is going to be. If we have, 17% of the country unemployed, when this is all over, like, how are we going to get back on our feet from that? And how is that going to impact our economy? I mean, nobody really knows. It's all conjecture at this point. So I think time will tell how, what the PTSD fallout is, the emotional fallout of all this is. And I think a lot of it depends on how long this continues. If in a couple weeks we pack it up and we're, back at work and back to life, might not be that traumatizing as it will be if this continues for months. And I think that the administration is aware of that. I think that all mental health professionals are aware of this. Surprisingly, I heard President Trump in the press conference last night say, this is trauma. He kept saying trauma. I thought, yeah, that's what gave me the idea for this video, that this is serious trauma in a different way for all of us. And I think that some people can especially people from the older generations, I used to know several Holocaust survivors, and they were through trauma that none of us could even imagine. Most of us could never even imagine, probably none of us. And a lot of them never went to therapy, and they just lived and moved on and lived their lives. Not that they didn't have nightmares and PTSD and all that, but they didn't go to therapy, and therapy wasn't so popular at that time. And still probably isn't popular enough. But that they lived lives. So do you have to go to therapy? No, you don't have to go to therapy for a trauma. We're capable, many of us, of just dealing with it on our own. But sometimes when the trauma is so severe, like loss of a loved one is always the number one that comes to my mind when I think of trauma. Losing a child, losing a parent, losing a best friend, losing someone that you love is usually the biggest traumas. Those are the most severe. And assaults, sexual assaults, abuse, all of those things that are really severe. Those types of traumas typically need therapy, or really would do much better if they had trauma therapy. But again, I've met Holocaust survivors who never had a day of therapy, and they managed to live their lives. So, it's a great question, and it's hard to say. Next, is trauma from the virus different than trauma from a single event like a death, since the virus is ongoing? Wow, these questions are killer today. Is trauma from the virus different than trauma from a single event like a death, since the virus is ongoing? I would say yes. Again, because trauma is relative, and because everybody experiences trauma and the post-trauma differently depending on 100 things, it's hard to say exactly what would be different from person to person and event to event, because what traumatizes me may not traumatize somebody else. So I think that the severity of the trauma and how it affects you has to do with so many things, like things that play into what makes the trauma more severe or less severe is it ongoing or a single event? What was the trauma? Did it happen to you, or were you a viewer of the trauma? Did you see someone else going through a trauma? What about culture, support systems, mental stability, financial resources? There's so many things that will play into how severe trauma is or isn't. And I understand from some articles that I've read that those Americans who are impoverished are really getting hit the hardest, and they don't have resources the way that people who are more affluent do. I think that's a big reason why that is becoming a statistical truth in this country. So I think there's a lot of things that are going to come out of this for this country, and I think a lot of good things will come out of it, because I think we're kind of self-reflecting right now, and I think we needed to do that. But yeah, I think losing a loved one, versus, fearing getting something, it's hard to compare and say, are they more severe or different? But I think it just really depends on the person and all the things that make up a person's perspective and experience. But these are really, really wonderful questions. So the last piece I want to get to, and I'm sorry if you're just tuning in, we've been talking this whole time about, is our nation in trauma right now? And I believe that it is. I did define what trauma is, and I did explain what PTSD is, and got so many incredible, really deep questions about what this means, what the implications of us being traumatized as a nation mean and look like in the future. And I'm sorry if you're just tuning in now, because I'm going to shortly be wrapping this up, but all of these live videos are available on my Facebook page for replay, and I put them on YouTube, and they're, I try to keep them really available, and I'm trying to do this every day, so that, people are, have somewhere to turn in the midst of all this trauma, because we're not hearing enough about the mental health impact on our country. And it's upsetting to me because I've been talking, if you've been watching this show from, starting a month ago, every single show, I'm talking about, the mental health impact and fallout from the coronavirus in the United States. And, just now I'm starting to hear some, doctors and news reporters touching on it for about a minute, and then we're on to the next. We're on to fighting about who's right and who's wrong, and do you hate the president? Do you love him? Is he doing a good job? Is he doing a bad job? Should we use the medication that's available or not? And blah, blah, blah. And we're not really focusing on the issues that are important, which is getting us out of this as soon as possible. And that's sad to me, but that is to be expected when people are under high stress and trauma. Again, we talked about why people are lashing out like this and why they're so emotional, and that is because everybody is impacted. Everybody's just really being severely impacted emotionally and psychologically and financially by what's happening in our country right now. So what I wanted to just touch on before we finish is, so many people are, asking, how can I cope with all of this? Those of us who are focusing on the mental health issues, we are asking, how can we cope and how do we deal with this? And, while I generally talk about the psychological and therapeutic aspects of this topic, of this subject rather, I know a lot of people are talking about faith and, their religious beliefs. And, this week is, in America, which is, a very Judeo-Christian country, not all, but majority is Judeo-Christian. We're dealing with Passover tomorrow for us Jews out there, and it's Holy Week and Easter Sunday coming up. And, while I think the holidays in general can make us sort of nostalgic and sad, missing the people that we've lost, and we're going to be thinking, I think this year a lot about what we've lost in the past month or so and what it means for the future. A lot of people are talking about, faith and, what their particular faith may say to them about what's happening right now. And, that works for many people, doesn't work for everybody. So I think that is something that if you have a spiritual connection or a religion that you believe in and that you follow, I think that this would definitely be a good time to turn to that for some inspiration and some comfort. But I also know that a lot of people that doesn't resonate with them, and that's totally cool. I mean, I don't think it really matters as long as you're a good person, what your religious beliefs are or not. But I think if you are not, a person who is, a religious person or a person who gets strength from the, field of faith, that there are other uplifting things to turn to. I've seen some beautiful poetry put out on the internet. I was going to read one of the poems I saw this morning, but I don't think I have time to do that today. But there's beautiful poetry and beautiful art and music and things and movies and things that can take our minds out of this time and give us some inspiration for the future and some hope. So I hope that everybody, I hope that everybody enjoyed this and found this helpful or interesting. And again, if you missed the trauma conversation we had today, it's available on replay on Actuation Counseling's Facebook page, on Actuation Counseling YouTube page, and also my personal page. It's out there, and I'm trying to put them on Instagram as well. So I hope that this was helpful for everybody, and I thank you all so much for watching today. And I will be back here tomorrow. And tomorrow, I'm not sure what I'm talking about, because I kind of decide every night what's the most pertinent thing in the news media that could be impacting us. And I try and, take that as a direction for how to discuss mental health. So we'll see again what we're going to talk about tomorrow, but I'm guessing it'll have something to do with the coronavirus. And I look forward to seeing you all back here tomorrow. You've been watching Liz Live on Facebook. Thank you all for watching, and be safe.